Hey friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today is going to be my January wrap-up, which is all of the books that I read in the month of January. And I did not follow my 2022 reading goals, which was to slow down. I have 18 books to mention. I will say a couple of them are picture books, a couple of them are graphic novels, but still 18 books is a little ridiculous. I separated them into genre categories. That's always a little bit easier for me to organize my thoughts. So let's start with mystery thrillers. I have 3 books to talk about. The actually first book that I read in the month of January happens to be a mystery thriller, and that is An Unwanted Guest by Sherry Lapina. It has a snowy, cabiny cover. I saw other people were reading it. It felt wintry. I gave this book 2 stars. It's a closed mystery. It's a bunch of people in a hotel, and there's this crazy blizzard, and everything gets shut down and closed off, and there's only a limited amount of guests in this hotel as well as the people who run it, and there's multiple perspectives from all of these various guests, and people keep mysteriously dying off. You don't really know who's doing the killing, and there's kind of like creepy stuff that keeps happening. And I wasn't totally compelled. I wasn't excited. I wasn't interested. And when the mystery at the end was revealed of like who the killer was and what happened, I was kind of like, okay, very underwhelmed. Not my favorite. Will definitely be passing this book along into another free library, and a very forgettable mystery. I read A Couple Next Door by this author. I ended up giving that 3 stars several years ago. Could not tell you what that book is about, and I think give this book a couple years and I'm gonna forget absolutely everything that happened in it because it wasn't a very interesting mystery thriller for me. Another snowy mystery thriller I picked up is Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. I picked this up because Tia from Tia and All the Books from her channel was doing a book club with her and her husband, and they were reading this book together, and there was a live stream, and that was really fun to join and chat with a bunch of people about this book. And I enjoy this one. I think I'm landing on 3.5 stars. I was a lot more compelled with the story and the plot and what was happening, and I was like trying to pick up clues, and it was a fun read, overall enjoyable. Again, it just sort of ended a little bit strangely, and you kind of don't really know what the author was intending for the characters. There also was a lot of red herrings, and some things didn't come full circle for me, and some plot holes that kind of felt silly. This book is about a married couple where the man is not able to recognize faces. I forgot what the condition is called. They end up going on this snowy retreat in Scotland to kind of work on their marriage, but a bunch of mysterious and uneasy things keep happening, and also the story unfolds in letters, and kind of the past is told leading up to the point of this snowy escape. So yeah, 3.5, enjoyable, but honestly also kind of probably forgettable. In a couple years, I probably won't remember it. This next mystery thriller is The Life We Bury by Alan Eskens. I picked this up because of Lindsay from Lindsay's Little Library and Sarah from Sarah's Nightstand. I think both mentioned it, and I was really in the mood to read like all my snowy wintry books, and I really enjoyed this mystery suspense thriller. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. This book's premise is about a young man in college who is given a writing assignment in one of his college classes to interview an older person about their life experience and write an essay about that. So he ends up going to a nursing home and trying to find someone to interview, and there's this man who was in prison, and he is really on his deathbed and his last kind of few months left to live, and so this young man decides to interview him and figure out why he was in prison and what crimes he committed. It's then revealed that he may have not done it, and so this main character is trying to unfold the mystery, dive into the court documents, try to figure out what happened, 20 years ago. It was very interesting. It was very fast paced. I was very into it and like wanted to know what happened. Also listened to this as an audiobook, as I do for a lot of my books, and just loved it. It was great. So as far as thrillers go, I thought that this one was a great one, and I'm usually quite picky with my mystery thrillers, but I really enjoy this one. Next, let's talk about nonfiction. So I think as well as trying to read and being in the mood for books that were snowy and wintry, I also kind of felt with January that I wanted like a clean slate with the books that I have and that I'm looking at in my house, and a lot of them were library books. So I really just was gravitating towards picking up the books that I've had forever checked out from the library and kind of reading them and then like returning them to the library soon. So I'm kind of cleaning out any lingering library books that I've had checked out for a while. And so several of these were library books as well as graphic novels. The first one is The Life of Frederick Douglass. I of course have heard of Frederick Douglass as an abolitionist. I feel like he was mentioned briefly in my history textbooks in school, but I didn't really have a strong understanding of who he was and his history and what led him to become famous and well known. And so technically this was categorized as a teen graphic novel, and I really enjoyed learning more about Frederick Douglass and his life. Along the same lines, I picked up Audubon, On the Wings of the World, and this is a nonfiction graphic novel. I picked it up because of the cover and all of these birds. This is all about John James Audubon, which I have not really heard of this person at all. The only reason why I knew what that name was because of a puzzle company, and there's like these puzzles that have a bunch of birds on them and they're named Audubon. He was a very famous ornithologist, I believe is the correct term, which is a scientist studying birds, and he became famously known for his bird paintings. He traveled all across the United States collecting, hunting, and basically getting specimens of birds and then painting them and putting together this book of all the birds of North America. This was also his life journey, his life story. He was a very interesting and unique individual. He did end up kind of like losing his mind a little bit in certain parts of this book and became overly obsessed with his craft and what he was doing. But yeah, this was just a very fascinating read and very interesting moment of history that I had absolutely no idea of before. So I really enjoyed this, and the illustrations in here are also beautiful. Another picture book that I picked up because of Tiffany from Beautiful Minutia is The Apartment, A Century of Russian History. This is a very large picture book. It's technically a middle grade nonfiction picture book and also has really cool illustrations in it. But this, of course, I was very intrigued because of the title, The Russian History, and I really enjoyed this one. Ended up giving it 4 stars as well. This is also a translated book, originally written in Russian. This book is a generational story following one main family starting in 1902 and ending in 2002, and every section skips a certain amount of years and mentions a different family member from the family tree that's also included in the beginning of the book. So this is based on a real family that lived in the Soviet Union and everything they experienced all throughout the 1900s. It was very fascinating for me and a very cool reading experience. Speaking of Russia, another book I picked up was Kachka, A Return to Russian Cooking by Bonnie Fruman Morales. I was gifted this by my lovely brother and sister-in-law for Christmas, and this is a cookbook. So it has beautiful images and recipes in here. This was a 5-star read. I actually did read this entire cookbook. The only parts that I skimmed over was the ingredient list for every recipe, but overall I read every other thing in this book because every single recipe included a paragraph description of either the history of that dish or a story from the author's family that's associated with that dish. And this was very much a cookbook, but it was also part memoir in a sorts, and I just found this book so relatable and I connected with it so much because the author, who's also a chef, is the daughter of Russian immigrants, and I am as well, and so there was some connections and relatability to this book. And also Kachka is a restaurant in Portland, so this author and chef is a chef in Portland, and I've been to this restaurant before, and it's pretty great. So this is like Russian cooking but elevated, a little bit fancier, but there's still a connection to like the original dish, and I absolutely loved this book. I know that I'm gonna definitely make some recipes in here, but even recipes aside, I enjoyed every other part of this book that this author wrote. It was fun, witty, quirky, relatable, and just felt like a slice of home, and so I love this one. It was a great book, and I would recommend if you are at all interested in Russian cuisine. I will say this is not for the picky eater though. There's a lot of weird and funny stuff in Russian cooking, and maybe for someone who is not used to that, they would not enjoy some of the things. My husband being a great example, he's a very much American boy who has not tried many things and was a very picky eater, and I have grown up eating bunch of weird stuff in Russian cuisine, so it's been fun being married and trying to get him to try different things. So anyways, again, would recommend if you're at all interested and intrigued by Russian cooking. Another 5-star nonfiction, easily the best book that I read this month, and will 100% be on my favorite books of 2022 list already. I know, it's only the first month, but I already know this is gonna be a favorite book of all time, and that is Penguin the Magpie, The Odd Little Bird Who Saved a Family by Cameron Bloom. This is a sweet little nonfiction that's also part memoir, part like family story, and it's also a photography book. So this book has various photographs on every page. This broke my heart. I was weeping, just absolutely weeping when reading this book. I think it was just a whole mix of things, you know, it was like the right time of the month and all the other things fell into place, and maybe I was just feeling a little bit sad that day. This just hit all the right places and hit right in the heart, and it was so incredible. This is a beautiful and heartwarming and also heartbreaking story of a family. The perspective that's written is from the husband's perspective. This family lives in Australia and the wife suffered a very tragic accident, leaving her paralyzed. And so it is her story of recovery, and around the time that she came home from the hospital, one of their kids discovered an injured baby magpie bird, which is a bird common in Australia, and they decided to take it in the home and rehabilitate it and raise it and take care of it, make sure it's okay. And it really became a part of the family, and it was just so wholesome, just right in the heart. If you love a book that will make you cry, that will just warm your heart, that is very beautiful to read, that also deals with hardship and grief and just some very tragic human things that happen. And so this is that kind of book, and now this is the book that I will be talking about all year long. It was so good, so good. I also did want to mention that there is a movie adaptation of this on Netflix called Penguin Bloom, and me and my husband watched it and it was pretty great. Obviously the book is much better, but the movie was also really fun and lovely and kind of brought the story to life in a certain way. But I would recommend the book and also the movie. It's a great pairing. This next book I picked up because of Buzzwordathon, and that was to read a book with the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, or how. And I picked up How Music Got Free, The End of an Industry, The Turn of the Century, and the Patient Zero of Piracy by Stephen Witt. This book came highly recommended and praised from a Book Olive, which I get a lot of nonfiction recommendations from. And I was intrigued by this title and this book because I was part of the generation that used LimeWire a lot. So I had an iPod, one of the first iPod Nanos, that was full of music that was completely pirated. I don't think I ever purchased a single song from Apple Music. I only illegally downloaded all of my songs, and that was completely normal. Like, my siblings did that and they taught me how to do that, and then my friends were doing that in school. Like, everyone did that and it was normal. And so I was very intrigued by this book to, I feel like, learn more about that, which this book does go into very detailed history about music piracy and the music industry. I am still very glad I read it. I ended up giving this 3 stars, but it was not a very compelling narrative nonfiction kind of book. It was very kind of dull and bland and not very exciting to read. I think even from someone who's interested in the subject matter, I found it boring. So I can only imagine that this really wouldn't be applicable to a lot of people who are not at all interested in the subject matter. Maybe for those who are very into the music industry. I actually forgot one more nonfiction book just looking at my pile on the floor, and this one was hidden. So one more nonfiction book, and that is a graphic novel, and it is Belonging by Nora Krug. Again, picked this up because it was checked out from the library and I wanted to read it. This is an adult graphic novel, a nonfiction about Nora Krug's life and diving into her family history of what it means to be a German and kind of dealing with the burden and the weight of having German history on your shoulders, of everything that happened during World War II and with Nazis and with Hitler and all of that, and what it means to be German and living through that experience. This book was a very unique reading experience. It felt like I was reading someone's diary and family scrapbook. So as an example, some of the pages in here are photographs and like random little diary entries, scribbles, drawings, handwritten notes, scanned letters, all of that. I feel like I have a new understanding and perspective of what it meant to be German living through that time period, and different choices that you had to make while you were living in that time period and dealing with all of the stuff that was happening around you. So very unique and really enjoyed this book. Gave it 4 stars. Next up, hopefully really briefly, I'll mention 2 picture books that I picked up this month. The first one is The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton. Now I picked this up because I was selling some honey to a customer here on our family farm, and we live on this like 4-acre property, and right now everything around us is getting subdivided. So there's just a ton of homes coming up all around, and eventually I think we're just going to be this little property completely surrounded by really large subdivision and homes all around. And I was talking about this with the customer because you could see the construction happening all around us, and she was like, hey, have you ever read the book The Little House? And I was like, The Little House on the Prairie? And she's like, no, just The Little House. It's a picture book. And she was talking about this book and how it was like a very sweet book, and this whole story is about that, about this little home and how time's changing and it becomes a home surrounded by a city. When I talk to someone in person about books, I feel like they become a lot more higher on my priority list. I mean, of course I will watch BookTube and get a bunch of recommendations from people, but there's like a personal connection with this customer, and so I really want to read it, and it's a picture book, so it's not going to take me a long time. But she sent me the Goodreads link to it and everything, and I immediately checked it out from my library and read it. Apparently this author, Virginia Lee Burton, I'm not very well versed in picture books, don't read a ton of them, don't really know too much, but she's a very like prolific children's picture book author. But this was a very sweet little book. I gave it 4 stars. It is about a little house that ends up starting on a farm, and then slowly but surely everything keeps changing around it. And I definitely see myself reading this to a future child someday. Another one I picked up from watching a lot of different people's 2021 favorites lists. This is a newer to me booktuber. I saw just one of her videos, Studio Lindsay. She was raving about this picture book, and that is Minette's Feast by Susanna Reich. This is all about the delicious story of Julia Child and her cat. I read My Life in France by Julia Child in 2021 and really enjoyed that book. Gave it 4 stars, and this one just felt very sweet because it's about Julia Child and also her cat. And now I'm a cat person. I never thought that I would be, but then COVID happened and we got a cat and it was our COVID baby, and that's a whole long story, but now I'm a cat person. And so I just thought that this was very sweet, cute little illustrations of Julia Child and her cat, and also gave this one 4 stars. It did feel like it was trying to be Julia Child's biography, but then trying to make it a children's story by talking about her cat randomly throughout, but I still enjoyed it. It's a sweet picture book. Next up, I will talk about the one classic that I ended up reading this month, and that is The Inheritance by Louisa May Alcott. This was a complete random pick from my library. I was just putting books away, as I do in my part-time job as a library aide, and I saw Louisa May Alcott in the adult fiction section. I don't know too much about Louisa May Alcott. I would love to read one of her biographies or autobiographies or whatever is out there about her because of how much I loved Little Women, and I read that recently in December. But I thought I'd pick this up because why not? And it's a short little book, and this was her first novel written at the age of 17. So this was not originally published. I believe it was just a collection, of pages that after her death her family found and then published after the fact. This I ended up giving 3 stars. It felt like an unfinished book, and it felt like a 17-year-old wrote this. Overall, it was still enjoyable, and I'm still glad I read it. I think it gave me a broader understanding of the author, and I'm very much intrigued to read much more from her than just like the Little Woman series. But overall, it was not a very memorable read and super exciting read. It felt kind of confusing at times, quite choppy. You could tell that it wasn't well edited or fully fleshed out yet in terms of characters and the plot as well. It's very like young and naive, and there's a love triangle, and there's this poor orphan girl who is just like this angelic character and absolutely nothing's wrong with her. And then there's all of these other richer characters that have taken her in, and everyone's falling in love with her. But then there's this one girl who's very jealous, and just like the different things that people got up to during the time period in England. So yeah, it was sweet. Still glad I read it, but definitely not an amazing book. Okay, we're nearing the end. Thank you for sticking with me. I have 6 historical fictions to talk about. The first one up is The Fiery Cross by Diana Gabaldon. I am making my way through the Outlander series. I read up to book 4 in 2021, and this is book 5. And so finished this one in January, started this in December, finished it in January. And this one was definitely probably my least favorite. No, I still really did not like the second book. This is my second least favorite out of the 5 that I've read, but still continuing on with the series because the characters are so well developed. The plot was just a little bit random. I felt like every character had like a near-death experience, and then it was just like waiting for them to get better. A book that I picked up for the Read Your Bookshelf challenge was to read A Quiet Like Word in the title, and I picked up Peace Like a River by Leif Enger, and I thought peace and quiet, they go together. I originally heard about this book from Krista from Books and Jams. I didn't really know much going in except that it was a historical fiction and a family story, maybe coming of age. I think those are like 3 things that I knew about it, and it was all of those things. It's very slow. There's not much that happens. There's one main thing that happens, which is it's the single dad and his 3 kids, and one of his sons commits murder. It's put in prison, but then he breaks out of prison and runs away. So him and his kids go to try to find his son. They go on this like epic adventure. There's a lot of focus around spirituality and faith in this book, although this is not a Christian fiction, but the father is a man who has very strong belief and faith and is someone who believes in miracles. This whole book's perspective is written and told from his younger sons, and so it's everything that he kind of saw in his father and what his father experienced and different things in his life, his relationship with his sister and his older brother that escapes prison. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It was a little bit slow for me. I totally understand why people love it, but I was honestly just a bit bored and not completely compelled with the characters and where the story went. I just felt like I needed more. There was really good character development, but for some reason, I just really wasn't excited about this book and really excited to read it. So yeah, that's a little bit of a bummer. It wasn't a bad book at all. it just wasn't a favorite and like a standout. And so I will probably be passing this along into a little free library for someone else to enjoy. Another historical fiction that is a new release that I picked up because I was in the wintry, snowy vibes is Once Upon a Wardrobe by Patty Callahan. I saw quite a few people reading this. I know that it had something to do with Narnia. I also ended up giving this one 3 stars. I liked it, not a bad book, but not a standout, and ultimately probably pretty forgettable for me. This book is set in 1950s England, post-World War II. It follows a young woman who is in college, and she has an 8-year-old brother who's very sick. He has a heart condition, and he's dying, and he will probably end up dying young. So you kind of know that off the bat. Her younger brother ends up absolutely being obsessed with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was a recent children's book that was published in the UK by C.S. Lewis, and he really wants to find out where Narnia came from. And so his older sister, who's also attending Oxford, where C.S. Lewis is a professor, ends up meeting with C.S. Lewis, and he ends up telling his life story of how he ended up writing Narnia, or really the events in his life that inspired certain things in Narnia. So this story was like a story within a story within a story, and I don't know if I like those kinds of books. I'm realizing I would much have rather C.S. Lewis come and just tell his life story to this young boy, but it was like someone telling a story to one character and then that character retelling a story to another character, and I didn't really love that flow. And I was much more compelled with C.S. Lewis's life story, so it got me excited to read C.S. Lewis's biography. But as far as this book goes, again, good, but not a favorite, and I would really only recommend this to people who have read Narnia, because if you haven't, then I feel like you'll be missing a lot from not knowing the Narnia story. Next up, I picked up on a whim from my library as well, and I've had checked out for a very long time. Glad I finally got to it, and that is Loving versus Virginia. This is a young adult historical fiction, although it very much reads like a nonfiction, so I'm surprised it was historical fiction. This is a free verse poetry novel. This is all about the very famous Supreme Court decision of Loving versus Virginia, where interracial marriage was legal in Virginia, and this is really the first couple that got married and fought the court system and made that existing law unconstitutional. This was their love story, their family story. This book starts in 1952 and ends up going all throughout the 1960s and 70s, and this was also a very unique read. I'm glad I read it. I learned so much more about this historical moment in this historical court case. I'm also very intrigued now to watch the movie by the same title that I've seen on Netflix. So yeah, I would highly recommend. This is a great book to pick up for February for Black History Month, as well as Loving, because love is in the title, if you're looking for a book for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge. And finally, the last book that I'm going to talk about, my first reread that I've had in a very long time, that is Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers. Now I'm going to ask you right off the bat, if you're at all interested in me creating a video about reviewing this book separately, as well as reviewing the movie that just came out. The movie adaptation of this book just came out in January. I watched that last night, actually. So I have a lot of thoughts about this book and about the movie, because this I considered my favorite book of all time. I read this for the first time 10 years ago when I was 16, and it was just the most amazing book I had ever read. The most amazing love story. I reread it again in 2017, and then I just reread it now. And it's still a very compulsive book. Like, I read this book very quickly. I was so into it, and I wanted to know what happened, even though I knew what was gonna happen, but I still was in it. And it also really made me cry at the end. This whole book is a biblical allegory for God's love. There's a lot of beautiful themes in here. However, I had some problems and I had some issues. I think since Booktube, and really since reading so many variety of books, I've become a much more critical reader. And so there was some stuff in here that it was kind of uncomfortable for me to read, and maybe I had some issue with. And I also have a lot of thoughts on the movie. So again, let me know if you're interested, because I feel like I could talk about this at length, and this is already a very long video, so I'm not gonna go into too many details. But I will say I still enjoyed this reread. I probably will be rereading it in my future at some point. I think it holds up, but maybe just not quite as much. So I don't know if this is gonna be a favorite book of all time for me still. I don't know, I'm still grappling with my thoughts on it. But again, let me know if you're interested in that video. I can make it, and if not, that's okay. Just move on. So that wraps it up. Thank you so much for sticking through this very long video. I really appreciate it. Let me know if you've read any of those, if you have any thoughts, if any of those sound interesting to you and now are added to your TBR, because I don't know, that always makes me happy. But I so appreciate you guys spending some time with me today, and I'll see you guys in another video soon. Bye.